All right, well, welcome to episode 2 of the Left Unsaid, where we plunge in and out of official narratives in the media, in the schools, and explore what's been left unsaid. I think we should celebrate today.
Why?
Well, we made it to episode 2.
Woo!
We're going to double the output of this podcast in a single
It's
sitting.
the only time we're going to be able to do that.
Yeah, I think so. Unless one day we could sit down and record 2 episodes. It depends if the masses want it. That's what the masses will get.
Sure.
I did look up, and I saw, according to, I think, Apple Podcasts, somebody out there, about 14% of podcasts only have 1 episode. So we're already in the top, 86%?
Fabulous.
Amazing.
Yeah. So congratulations to both of you. I'm Patrick McElwee, and I'm joined by my lovely wife, Meg.
Hey.
And my lovely son, Finn.
How's it going?
Good. It's going good. And we're excited to just chit-chat about what's been happening in the news.
Nothing. It's just really boring around here in the U.S.
That's why we started a podcast, because there wasn't enough interest out there.
Right.
So we're trying to generate some controversy for the people. And also what's been going on in the schools. Finn, sophomore in high school, looking forward to college admissions, college application process. We care about what happens in the colleges here, and there's been a lot happening.
There has been.
Yes.
Well, one thing we want to talk about was this crazy letter that the Trump administration sent to Harvard University. I don't know if y'all got a chance to look at the details. I know probably everybody listening to the podcast, knowing our audience, we're really an audience of just a couple people so far, some former neighbors, but we know that they don't dig deep past the headlines. Well, we don't know that, but we assume because we know them from other contexts. We don't watch them read the news. Maybe we'll do a focus group with them some point. Just say, read the news. Don't mind us. We'll just be taking notes. See how you do.
I like it.
Anyway, the Trump administration sent this crazy letter to Harvard on a Friday. I think it was maybe like 2 Fridays ago at this point. We're recording this on Easter Sunday. And over the weekend, Harvard took the pretty incredible and pretty drastic step of saying, no, they're not going to do what the Trump administration wanted. Now, they put the normal boilerplate in there that they're against anti-Semitism in all forms.
Of course, you had to have that in there.
Which we all are against anti-Semitism. But with the implication that criticizing Israel in the context of an ongoing genocide constitutes anti-Semitism, which we, of course, reject here on this podcast.
Yes.
And it's rejected by people all around the world. So Harvard came out and said, we're not going to do it. And immediately the Trump administration publicly threatened to cut off $2.2 billion in funding to Harvard University. And then Trump got on social media and threatened to cut off their tax-exempt status, which is a pretty big deal.
Okay. What do you make of that, Finn?
It's pretty crazy, definitely. As someone who's looking at going to college in a few years, seeing all the pressure that can be exuded on these universities is definitely astounding. A little bit authoritarian. I have their letter pulled up here, and one of the bullet points that the Trump administration sent to Harvard was to institute viewpoint diversity in admissions and hiring, which essentially just means you have to bend to our ideological tilt, which is something we've also seen in other authoritarian societies as these people try to consolidate control. Academia is an important source of power.
So do I understand that you're against viewpoint diversity then?
No, not at all. Just I'm against the government controlling what is taught in the universities. This is not really about viewpoint diversity. It's about they want one viewpoint and it's their viewpoint, and they don't want the university to tolerate other viewpoints. For example, another bullet point they have is reforming programs with egregious records of anti-Semitism or other bias.
So does that mean targeting Middle Eastern studies, those kind of programs, correct?
Yeah, I would assume so. It says they include the Divinity School, Graduate School of Education, School of Public Health, Medical School, Religion and Public Life Program, Health and Human Rights, Center for Middle Eastern Studies, Carr Center for Human Rights. You see, these are not anti-Semitic institutions. These are not institutions, with an unacceptable bias. They just want the bias to go towards them in these institutions. That's what this is all about.
I mean, it's been this long hobby horse of the conservative movement here in the United States that they're somehow excluded from universities, and that this is a question of groupthink rather than a question of people who actually get down and dirty with the truth and the facts and the kinds of interpretations that they come up with based on that.
I mean, from our personal experience, it's just it's sort of laughable. It's a laughable argument. Of course, there is a diversity of viewpoints, and they're always, at least where you and I have had experience in higher education, notably Notre Dame. There's plenty of conservative voices.
Go drunk Irish. Yeah, there's so many conservative voices. I mean, during my brief time as an undergrad in Notre Dame, I got to run the viewpoint section, the opinion section of the student newspaper. And I was really trying to make that thing a left-wing rag, and I couldn't. Just so many conservatives, just the whole field. I wasn't really trying. Back then I really deeply did believe in diversity of viewpoint and free speech, and I still do, I guess.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm a little less naive about it, in the ways in which I'm not sure that just arguing about things brings you closer to the truth. I think a lot of times there's a lot of power dynamics that intersect with speech and all that kind of stuff.
For sure.
But, back in 2003 when we were at Notre Dame, there was this guy, David Horowitz, and he was going around the country basically just trying to pick fights with student newspapers, trying to get this narrative into the discourse that universities shut down conservative students. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it was new when David Horowitz was doing it, but the New York Times wrote a piece about the Notre Dame student newspaper because we rejected an advertisement that seemed like it had racist overtones. And it was a big showdown. We had to, go to the mat, write all these editorials. We were getting denounced all across the country. And I feel like that 20 years ago was kind of a dim echo of what they're managing to do now.
Sort of the vanguard of this, honestly.
But it's like a grievance that they've had against the universities for a long time.
To be a little snarky here, my guess is that there are some conservative students who come in to college with conservative viewpoints, and they find themselves for the first time really confronted with different worldviews. I'm just going to use a family member as an example. He grew up, I personally didn't grow up in an evangelical Christian worldview, but he did. And he went to college and for the first time came to understand that there were many, many ways to live in the world. And I can say that his father, who still holds those views, is struggling to accept that his son's views have changed, because when his son went to college, he did end up changing his viewpoint. His eyes were open. He had friends who didn't have the same religious and political views that he grew up with. And so I happen to know that the dad views that college experience as almost an experience of indoctrination for his son.
And I think it's a view of the university and a view of the world in which you come with sort of fixed viewpoints. I mean, just the way that the podcast environment is currently, where everybody's got their sort of biases, their perspective on things. And as if you did the same thing when you came to the university and you came to a seminar and you were just, each person represents their fixed ideology and the professor arbitrates. And I also think the professor arbitrating is a big part of this. It's the idea that the professors sort of have the knowledge and they pump it into the students, or they have the ideology and they indoctrinate the students, rather than it being flatter than that, where with students being respected and with the fact that you have to have an argument to back up your viewpoints.
You do have to have an argument to back up your viewpoints. And I think that a lot of conservative students who do continue through the process and they leave the university system with those viewpoints still intact, I do think that it could be a frustrating experience for them.
But it's been a while since we've been...
That's true.
Undergrads, I was a TA, but that's still been a while, about 15 years ago at Duke. Finn, maybe we'll ask you. You last summer went to a seminar on civil disobedience at St. John's University in New Mexico.
St. John's College. Yeah.
St. John's College. What was your experience? Was it indoctrination camp?
No, absolutely not. It was a week-long seminar. We read like a couple of foundational texts going back to Greek philosophy all the way up to like Letter from a Birmingham Jail, the Declaration of Independence, texts like those. And then like you were saying, we had a lot of different students from a lot of different political and religious, et cetera, viewpoints. And it was very much an open conversation that was moderated by a professor, which, I understand is maybe pretty unique to St. John's, but it was definitely an experience where everyone widened their viewpoints and really understood viewpoints from different stances coming from different environments. And I think that's a lot of what these conservative politicians are trying to avoid. They're trying to isolate their intellectual core from outside opinions and views.
Yeah, and my impression is, if you come into the university and you've got these myths in your head that tell you why you're good and why your family's good because daddy's a real estate developer or he owns a car dealership or whatever, in normal day-to-day life, people generate a whole lot of so-called common sense that justifies where they are in the world, that tells them that they're good, that tells them that what they're doing is good and they don't really need to worry about changing unethical behavior, helping the poor, joining a left-wing revolutionary movement to overthrow capitalism, but that they're fine just continuing, to do whatever is allowing their family to reproduce its class status in the world, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think when you get into school and you are trying to just justify your myths or just regurgitate what you've been told, and you're asked to justify it on the basis of, I think seminal texts, sure, is the professor coming up with a list of things that you're supposed to engage with? Yeah, I think they are. But these things are things that have been debated for a long time. Like you're talking about Greek plays.
Right. Didn't you read Cato?
Yeah, Cato the Younger.
Which we should note, the Cato Institute, one of the leading right-wing think tanks, is named for Cato, this Greek character.
Right.
What was the school of thought that Cato belonged to? He wasn't a Stoic, was he? No.
He was kind of an asshole, that I remember.
He's kind of an iconoclastic rebel. Is that right? He's kind of a jerk. We got a clean rating so far in our first episode. Finn has just dropped the first curse word. Leave it to Gen Z. All right, somebody get on there and change that to explicit.
So Finn went to St. John's College for this summer seminar, and St. John's College is a great books institution. So everybody who goes there is reading the same texts and discussing them in small Socratic seminars.
What are great books? Like just the good ones?
Right. That's the there's a canon that they read, great works, right?
Which is like the Western white male canon,
right.
basically.
Although they do introduce Eastern philosophy and texts when they came to be known by the Western world. So they are read, but because you really start in a great books program, like way back, right? You're starting with Thucydides and like the Greek philosophers, and then you sort of move forward chronologically through this historical canon, this philosophical canon. I also had an experience. I studied in a great books program at Notre Dame, and it did really inform my philosophy of education because, like Finn, I was in a classroom with people of all political spectrums, religious spectrums, and the powerful part of a Socratic seminar is that the professor doesn't have a view of her or himself as the disseminator of knowledge. Their role is to guide and ask questions of the students. And they're the students using the texts, using their own personal experiences in life. They are the ones who are making arguments, who are trying to make sense of what was written. Ideally, would every college class, even every high school class, have this component of critical inquiry and respect for a bunch of opinions in defense of, say, what the Trump administration is saying. Not that I defend it, but they really don't like the idea of having a professor like lecture students, right?
But they don't like that idea. I actually think they do like that idea. They just want it to be right think.
Exactly. But they don't like a lefty professor doing that, right?
I'm sure there's some aspect of conservative activists, like conservative student activists, who do think because everyone disagreed with me in my seminar, my speech is being repressed, and maybe they think the professor's on the other side. But the reason I say I think that what they're actually looking for is something more authoritarian, including in the classroom, is because of this letter that they sent to Harvard.
Right.
I mean, the authoritarianism just oozes out of this letter. They want to have full information on everyone who applies to Harvard and how admissions decisions were made. They want all that information to go to the government so they can
That's
review
insane.
Harvard's admissions data. And we know to what end, right? We know because they think that white men are being excluded somehow from the university spaces. Ridiculous. They want control over the thought patterns of students. I mean, they name specific student groups in here, being named by the White House to be subject to discipline. They name Students for Justice in Palestine. They name the National Lawyers Guild, right, which is sort of a leftist legal body. Great people. If you ever get a chance to hang out with some people from the National Lawyers Guild, guarantee you a good time. I got to pick some of them up for a protest in Durham a few years ago. Those people are hilarious. So fun. Harvard Graduate Students for Palestine, Law Students for Palestine, the Harvard Palestine Solidarity Committee. So those thoughts aren't allowed. And not only are they not allowed, they're demanding in this letter that Harvard impose a draconian disciplinary policy against people who have these particular kinds of thoughts.
I mean, Finn, do you think you'll even be able to get into college with your political views?
Maybe me being a white man will cancel them out.
I don't think so.
And it's also important to note that although Harvard has been resisting thus far, other colleges, like notably Columbia, have just completely capitulated to this type of demands and are just cooperating fully with the Trump administration.
And it's worth noting that while we heard about the public retaliation, and clearly there's this war that's sort of amping up between Harvard and the Trump administration, is on Monday, after that letter was sent on Friday, and the Harvard then sent its own letter saying we can't do this, the Trump administration has sort of hedged and said, well, that letter wasn't really ready to be sent out yet. We were still negotiating. And the implication, I think, is maybe that they were going to hold back that letter for some amount of time, but it still represents the endpoint of where they want to go.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they haven't pulled it back. So I think it's actually very helpful to have it in the debate. It's obviously helpful to get a huge university with such a storied history, with such an endowment as Harvard University to at least be standing up to some degree. I think it was important during the McCarthy era when the military stood up against McCarthyism. While I'm usually not on the side of the military, I probably don't agree with their reasons for doing it. It's still within a society like ours, it's helpful to have competing centers of power, right?
Yeah.
And likewise, usually we would have no special affinity for Harvard University.
Right.
Yeah, we have no special affinity for Harvard University. So I was reflecting on the fact that this is all being organized around suppression of speech related to the U.S. funding and arming of Israel in Palestine. I mean, this is like the central political cancer. It's the thing that the Trump administration is able to use to justify all this crazy repression that's going on locally. And I was just thinking about how that relates to this long theme. One of the main themes when people discuss the rise and the fall of the Roman Empire, for example, is a way in which republics, like the Roman Republic, like the American Republic, the U.S. Republic, get undermined when they go abroad as an empire.
Right.
The Biden administration thought, in their view of the world, that they could support a genocide abroad while maintaining a liberal democracy here. Like you can export the chaos out past the borders and inside maintain a liberal democracy. And I think what we're seeing is that what they were actually doing was digging the grave of that liberal democracy.
I mean, to be honest, they've been digging it for a long time.
And they're fine with internal repression as long as it's against people who are, who are speaking out against U.S. imperialism abroad. They were totally fine with, New York City police's raids on Colombia and brutal police repression that many pro-Palestinian encampments were subjected to under the Biden administration.
Yeah, that's completely right. And so there was an initial, the first repression we have to acknowledge happened under a Democratic president, under Democratic governors, under Democratic mayors. Look at Los Angeles, look at Colombia, before the Trump administration ever got elected, just like you said. And so I guess
but it's been happening for a long time, right? Like you think about how the CIA has worked behind the scenes to undermine democracy elsewhere, and not just in the U.S., right? And you think about all the entire colonial project. Think about Britain and what they did. It's quite a task to be anti-democratic elsewhere and supposedly democratic at home.
And one of the ways it's functioned here in the United States is the military-industrial complex, which Eisenhower, Republican president after World War II, cited as a major danger. And he did actually call it the military-industrial congressional complex. And I think we can see the ways in which, since World War II, certainly, Congress has become this arm of the national security state, because every congressional district has got some military jobs in it, some military money coming in. And so Congress has completely given up the power that's supposed to be assigned to it in the Constitution to declare or not declare wars. Because to have a vote on whether or not a war is okay or ongoing drone strikes are okay would be a politically difficult vote for Congress to take. And so they've completely abdicated that to the executive branch. So Finn, I was wondering about this because you've been studying for AP Government, Advanced Placement Government.
Yep. Wish me luck.
All right. Much luck to you. So you can get into one of these elite institutions, reproduce your class status.
Thank you.
What are you taught in AP Government? Are you taught about, do you wrestle with this? Because I know, what did the founders think was going to happen between Congress and the executive branch?
Well, the founders actually, they envisioned Congress to have an enormous amount of power, so much power that it would outweigh significantly both the executive and the judicial branch. And so they split it up into two, the Senate and the House of Representatives. And the founders were, I think they were especially concerned about this because ostensibly, at least the House, before, senators were directly elected by people, was supposed to represent the people. And they were worried for all kinds of reasons about that. So they made sure to limit the power, but it was still supposed to be the most powerful branch of government. What we're seeing now, what we've seen since then is, their kind of thesis on that was completely wrong. Now we're seeing both the Supreme Court and the executive branch under Trump wielding vastly more power than Congress has been wielding.
And I'm asking you this, I think we all can see this, the fact that Congress is unable to do much of anything. It's stuck in this gridlock. We're seeing a worsening because the Trump administration is trying to grab the purse strings, right? Congress is supposed to appropriate the money, decide where it goes, and the executive branch now is just saying, no, we'll just slash USAID or the State Department or whatever they want to. But I'm asking you, Finn, because a lot of us, it's been a long time since we've sort of studied these things. And I know you're reading the Federalist Papers, which is kind of, those are the interpretive documents that came out around the Constitution, right? That when they were trying to get the Constitution passed at the 1780s or something like that. When you study U.S. government, what are you studying? Are you studying sort of an idealized version of the U.S. government, or do you wrestle with the way it's evolved over the years?
Absolutely. It's an idealized version of the U.S. government, beginning from when we talked at the beginning of the year about slavery and how there was a lot of debate about slavery in the chambers of the Constitutional Convention, and that, they unfortunately, had to do it for political reasons, keep slavery, but their hearts were really against it, all the way up to the basic assumption that legislators respond directly to their constituents. There's this idea that the legislators can do one of a couple of things. They can be trustee, which is the idea that they vote directly according to their constituents' wishes, or they can be a more savvy politician and vote according to what they think is right But, never is it mentioned, do they take into account donors or anything like that? When in reality, that's what members of Congress spend 90% of their time doing. So it's very much these basic assumptions, the Constitution is all good.
And that it's a machine kind of humming well, working well.
If I understand, the model is basically two options. They do what they think is right. They do what the people want them to do back home, or maybe some mix of the two. But this model leaves no room, like you said, for corporate power and so on.
Yeah.
Well, maybe you can write that in your essay for the AP test.
It's trying to make me fail.
But what I got to say, like, other thing that totally is striking to me in this moment is that at the same time that the empire is coming home, there's this dismantling of the empire that was built after World War II.
Absolutely.
After World War II, we talk about the Bretton Woods system, and that includes things like the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. It was a system after World War II that put the United States at the center of, at least half the world, right? This is where you get the origins of the Cold War, the Soviet Union controlling its sphere of influence, the United States controlling what they called the free world. The third world being sort of all those smaller states, particularly post-colonial states that were gaining their independence and were torn between the two and fell neatly into neither camp. Mm-hmm. There was so much soft power that the United States has been wielding since then, and it's represented in all kinds of humanitarian projects, NGOs proliferated around the world.
Now, Patrick, you wrote your honors senior thesis in college on this sort of concept, right?
Yeah. I mean, my dissertation was going to be on NGOs, U.S. NGOs, other international NGOs in Haiti over the course of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. And I think in all that soft power, there's some good things that happened in it.
Can you just talk about exactly what is soft power as opposed to hard power?
Yeah. I mean, soft power is providing money to give drugs to, not fun drugs, but like needed drugs. Not that drugs are fun, kids. Not drugs aren't fun, Finn. But needed drugs to AIDS patients, for example. I mean, the George W. Bush administration, that I have very little love for, actually had a great AIDS program, and they helped bring down the price of AIDS medications around the world under lots of pressure from activists that started long before the George W. Bush administration came into power, but that laid the framework for them to be able to do this. Mm-hmm. And I think there were people inside the Bush administration that were committed to providing drugs to people with AIDS, and it's been an important thing. So that's an example of positive soft power that we would all want to see happen. Mm-hmm. There's some things that seem good, like food aid, mm-hmm. that can also be very problematic. So food aid sounds great, food to people who are hungry. Hard to argue with that, but what it often becomes is a cover for what we call dumping. So the aid really goes to U.S. farmers. It props up the price. It lets them do this monocropping that they do, and to support that whole very extractive, fossil fuel heavy farming system. Food aid from the United States could only be delivered to third countries via ships that flew the U.S. flag. And when the food got there, it would undermine the ability of that country to support its own farming base by flooding the country with cheaper food.
Patrick and I spent 3 years living in rural northern Mexico, where we lived close and sometimes among the indigenous folks there, the Tarahumara, the Raramuri. It's pretty obvious there that the food imperialism of the United States has a really negative effect on the native seeds and the native foods in northern Mexico. Corn there is revered. They have so many different types of corn, native corn, and they struggle to keep those native seeds because of the dominance of Monsanto crops.
Yeah, right. And transgenic crops.
Absolutely, yeah. Like making seeds that basically self-destruct after one crop. So you have to purchase the seeds, or they engineer seeds so that you have to purchase a specific pesticide or herbicide in order for them to grow. Mm-hmm, So anyway,
and in Mexico,
food aid is complicated.
Food aid's complicated, and I think that's an example of how it undermines local food cultures all around the world, mm-hmm. and also the ability of those local food cultures to reproduce themselves generation from generation for the ability of farmers to save seeds, like you're talking about. And actually, Mexico, which is in the middle of a peaceful social democratic revolution, in my opinion, they recently amended the constitution to ban any corn that has been genetically modified because corn is so essential to the culture, the food culture of Mexico. And beyond that, soft power can be something that's much more nefarious. So you have so-called democracy promotion all around the world that got funded by USAID. For example, in Mexico, there is a think tank with a really sort of misleading name. It's something like the Committee for Transparency in Government. And this Committee for Transparency in Government was so funded by USAID, and it worked to undermine the social democratic revolution that I was just talking about, a revolution that took place through electoralism, through elections, and elected a party, Morena, that just recently won like 67% of the vote in a free and fair election, completely sweeping away the previous parties. Imagine if, the Green Party here or somebody or some new party we'd never heard of, if Bernie back in 2016 had started a new political party and had just swept away the Democrats and Republicans.
And then imagine that Republicans and Democrats, standard Republicans and Democrats, had to become allies and
merged.
run candidates together.
Exactly what happened.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, the United States, through USAID, was funding so-called democracy promotion that seek to undermine that process, and it completely failed. And so you have a social democrat, a humanitarian like Claudia Sheinbaum, who's currently the first female elected president of Mexico. And she was asked about the gutting of USAID by the Trump administration. And because of her experience with them trying to undermine democracy while claiming to be promoting it in Mexico, she said, I think maybe it's better that USAID go away. Now, she immediately followed up by saying the United States should be promoting health, security, economic well-being of people all around the globe, not least because by bringing that kind of stability to people in, say, Central America is going to reduce the chances that MAGA people are going to be frightened by seeing brown people coming in, living nearby them, because you can take away the need for people to migrate and so on. But that's all soft power, right? And it goes far beyond that. It's a vast complex. It's mostly self-serving. It mostly doesn't work. Like, for example, after the earthquake in Haiti in, 2008, 2009, terrible earthquake, killed so many people. There was an enormous outpouring of care from just ordinary folks all around the world. Billions of dollars were donated to Haiti, and almost none of it reached the people on the ground. They were left to fend for themselves, and now Haiti's in a nightmare.
We can have a whole episode on Haiti coming up here, right?
But that's another example of soft power, and really how it doesn't work very well. Well, for the people on the ground. But it worked well for the empire, provided the glove around the fist. And the Trump administration, as far as I can tell, just wants to rip
off that glove.
Exactly.
I think they're also just pretty stupid. I think they fall for the U.S. empire's lies about, promoting democracy and promoting aid and welfare, and they just hate
women's issues,
women's rights. They take it for face value and they say, no, we hate that, and then get rid of it.
That could very well be the case.
Right. They actually think that democracy promotion means democracy promotion. I don't think there's not that many deep thinkers among this new crew that's taken over the White House, as far as I can tell. And I don't know if you've seen all these competing memos, it seems like, that are floating around in the White House on how exactly they're going to gut the State Department, for example. And if you're gutting the State Department, you're probably going to be replacing the U.S. presence abroad with something like the Pentagon. That's really the main competitor to the State Department. It always has been. Throughout the Iraq War, there was a constant give and take. There was a constant sort of bureaucratic battle between the Pentagon and the State Department for who was going to have primacy over U.S. policy in the Middle East, for example.
Right. And a quote here, I'm reading from a New York Times article that came out today about this sort of leaked idea of how they're going to gut the State Department. What they're saying is that they want to pretty much dismantle anything in Africa. Like, they're wanting to just get rid of it.
Yeah, no more embassies in Africa.
No embassies. Except they'll leave a skeleton force there It says the office would focus on a handful of issues, including, quote, coordinated counterterrorism operations, so military, right?
Right. Of course.
And, quote, strategic extractions and trade of critical natural resources, end quote.
So domination and extraction. That's it.
How lovely.
No diplomacy.
Zero.
Welcome back, Dutch East India Company.
Ooh, tell us a bit about Dutch East India Company.
We learned quite a bit about, the Spanish Empire, the Dutch Empire, and world history. That was last year for me. But, they basically function. I mean, this is almost like a mercantile policy, that the U.S. is trying to re-implement, just to, militarily dominate these regions to the extent necessary to extract their resources and take them back for, U.S. production. That might be also in part why he seems to be in love with the word tariff.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And it seems to me it's overlooking a fundamental political problem, which is the problem of legitimacy. I mean, maybe it's the case that they just want to dismantle the empire and make the United States one big, strong bully in a world of big, strong bullies. You'll have the U.S. and its sphere of influence, Russia and the Chinese. But what they're giving up by giving up soft power is that problem of legitimacy. And it's like, have they never read and struggled with the writings of Machiavelli or Hobbes or Rousseau? I mean,
no, definitely not. But tell us a little bit about those.
Well, it's just that in order to exercise power effectively, without legitimacy, they're going to have to rely on force and violence. Or they're probably also going to lose power around the world. And I think for us, for many people, for leftists in this country, we've wanted to see a diminished role of the U.S. around the world because we've seen it doing such terrible things around the world, but not like this, right? The goal was to go towards a more egalitarian world, but instead we're getting, the ungloved fist.
What I find fascinating about this political shift in the U.S. is that you now see folks on the right, and this may be just because of what you said, Finn, that they really do believe that the soft power democracy promotion was actually promoting DEI, et cetera. But you see right-wing folks sort of having this sort of anti-imperialist rhetoric.
You do see that. I mean, I was just looking at this Facebook post my mom put up. My mom's been doing really great stuff. My mom.
Oh, grandma. She's been making posters.
My parents are great. They're sort of rainbow Catholics.
Mm-hmm. Standing up for immigrants. They live in Florida, so they're sort of rapacious right-wing
They're so
neighbors.
surrounded by MAGA.
Mm-hmm.
But she's been doing these posts, calling for loving thy neighbor, like you say,
mm-hmm.
calling for peace. And she had one commenter, Cindy, who, among all kinds of fear mongering about the risk of getting mugged and raped by immigrants every day, you do wonder how often Cindy gets mugged down in Florida. But in the middle of this screed against loving your neighbor, against helping people who need help, she says, the USAID has been a front for the CIA, which is crazy. It's like, that's a leftist critique, right?
Right.
And it's traveled from the left to the right in some way.
And now you see, on ostensibly the left, liberals during the hands-off protest, I saw some signs that were like hands-off USAID. So they've kind of accepted this defending of institutions, which is, not what we should do. We don't want anti-imperialism to be a right-wing thing. We have to retake it and do it, the right way on the left. So that's a mistake I think I've seen a lot of liberals make, which is, defending the institutions without accepting the need for drastic reform in the pre-existing institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. But I also get, it's hard to call for reform when the thing's being destroyed altogether. But yeah, I think you said to me, Finn, earlier this week, that they think the CIA is doing woke, right?
Finn, didn't you read a book last year that was you might recommend to folks about the CIA if they're into just light reading? The Devil's Chessboard, is that what it was?
About Alan Dulles and the creation of the CIA, I think, right?
Yeah. I mean, I can tell you, they're definitely not doing woke.
Did they do woke in Iran in 1954 when they overthrew democratically elected Mossadegh and put in the Shah?
So yeah, in 1953, the CIA was doing a lot of woke in Iran. They were actually involved in overthrowing a democratic, socialist adjacent elected prime minister, and they instituted a dictatorship, which the media doesn't tell you about an awful lot.
Why was the United States and the CIA interested in what was going on in Iran at the time?
I mean, it was twofold, right? They had this idea about, the anti-communism and the domino effect, which in this case was ridiculous. The prime minister, Mossadegh, was not communist, not even communist adjacent, but they also wanted to protect American oil interests and British oil interests in the region. And it was, almost part of this process of Britain handing over their empire to the United States. They went to the United States and were like, we don't have the ability to orchestrate this coup. We need you to do it. We have companies there. You have companies there.
Oil companies.
Yeah. And it was because the prime minister nationalized the oil companies that the CIA went in there and in their first coup overthrew him.
Leading to, in 2 decades.
Yes, it led to the Iranian Revolution.
Major imperial blowback. Never brought up in the current context of anti-Iranian posturing by the United States and Israel. The fact that the groundwork for the Islamic government was laid by a CIA-backed woke coup.
That's right. It behooves us to remember, as consumers of news and information, to always ask the question, like, why? Why is this country or this situation, why is it being vilified by the traditional news, the corporate news media? Iran was the boogeyman, which is why you went to read this book in the first place. You had this question, you were seeing Iran portrayed as the boogeyman, and it's great to be able to ask why and to just continue that critical inquiry deeper, like, well, why is this way? And you just keep on going deeper and deeper, and you oftentimes eventually end up in some sort of soft power or hard power United States intervention in a lot of these countries.
Yeah, there were so many. Well, we might be reaching the end of the soft power interventions and the beginning of pure hard power, although I would consider a coup to be pretty hard power. Well, this draft memo that's been circulating for how to gut the State Department, it has one section that I think can bring us to the end of our podcast and get us that legally required section on artificial intelligence that all podcasters in 2025 must include, because part of the proposal in the White House for the State Department is, as they're decimating the number of staff all around the world, they are going to mandate the use of artificial intelligence in drafting all documents and reviewing all documents that go in and out of the State Department, which is a lot of what the State Department does. If you ever want to be a historian and go in the archives, you're going to find a lot of memos flying all around the State Department. Well, we're going to replace human writing and reading of those things with artificial intelligence. So looking forward to the generative coup d'etats in the future.
Right, AI it looks like you're trying to overthrow a country. Would you like some help?
Yeah, like a little clippy character. all the imperialism, none of the paperwork.
Which is another way, if you listen to our first episode, we talk a lot about this sort of putting a barrier between the people inflicting the suffering and the sufferers, right? That's AI intermediary. I'm sure it makes that easier for folks, right?
Yeah, not that it was all that hard for them before, but
well,
God forbid it get easier.
I also did see that they're planning to rework how they recruit and how they hire for the State Department, this new boiled down version. And they're doing away with what I believe was a pretty rigorous exam to get in. And of course, you have to express fidelity to the president's viewpoints. But I love that it's also like this AI use because, hey, maybe you just don't need to be that smart. You don't need to have that. You don't need to be able to write.
Just a little bit of prompt engineering, and that's how we're going to run the empire.
And it's also important to note that this is not executive order. Like, this has not been implemented yet. It's just a possible direction that they're thinking about.
Yeah, they've
taking the State Department.
Right.
They've got various circulating ideas, but in the end, they definitely want to cut their State Department, it sounds like, by something like in half in terms of budget. Well, this podcast has not been brought to you by OpenAI or DeepSeek or any of the other competing artificial intelligence services out there.
Should we recommend a movie for folks to watch?
Sure, if you've got one.
Finn, I think you have one, right?
Yeah, we recently watched a documentary that Al Jazeera put out called Real War, which is about,
REEL.
Yes, it's about the archives of Palestinians and how they were stolen by the Israelis. This Israeli filmmaker goes to try to uncover some of them, and it really does a good job at taking this large conflict and distilling it by looking at it through a single thread. It's really revealing and really emotionally impactful. So I would definitely recommend people check it out.
Yeah, I would say haunting. And then also just the fact that if you don't have your film archives, it's almost like you didn't exist.
Right.
At least in the 20th century. Well, once again, ending on a happy note for episode 2 of the Left Unsaid. Hopefully we'll make a third one and y'all can join us. Thanks.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.